Counsellors, Psychotherapists and Psychologists Explained. In this episode, we'll explore the differences between counsellors, psychotherapists and psychologists, and then use that understanding to pivot directly into the kinds of concepts people recognise in everyday life. These three titles are often used interchangeably, which can make the landscape feel confusing. Someone might say they're seeing a therapist, a counsellor, or a psychologist without being clear of what that actually means. This episode is about clarifying these roles in a practical way, not to create hierarchy, but to support understanding. Counsellors are trained primarily to work through therapeutic conversation. Their role centers on offering a structured, professional relationship where experiences can be explored, understood, and reflected on over time. Counselling training focuses heavily on relational skills, ethical practice, and how to support people through ongoing dialogue. Psychotherapists also work therapeutically, but their training often places greater emphasis on theory, longer-term work, and depth of exploration. Psychotherapy is commonly associated with approaches that look closely at patterns, relationships, and the influence of earlier experiences. In practice, the work of a counsellor and a psychotherapist can look very similar, particularly when they are trained in the same approach. Psychologists are trained within a broader discipline. Psychology includes research, assessment, theory, and applied work. Some psychologists provide therapy, while others focus on assessment, teaching, or research. Their training usually involves extensive academic study alongside applied practice. A helpful way to think about this is to imagine three people working in education. One teaches in the classroom, one designs curricula, and one researches how people learn. All are working in education, but their roles are different. Counsellors, psychotherapists, and psychologists occupy different positions within the wider mental health field in a similar way. In everyday life, what often matters more than the title is the nature of the work being offered. Two practitioners with very different titles may work in a very similar way. Equally, two people with the same title may work quite differently depending on their training and orientation. This brings us to an important shift. Up to now, the series has focused on roles, structures, and approaches. That foundation matters, but most people do not walk around thinking in terms of professional titles. They think in terms of experience. They think in terms of feeling anxious before meetings. They think about patterns in relationships. They notice how they react when someone pulls away or gets too close. They wonder why the same situations seem to trigger the same responses. This is where concepts become more useful than labels. Instead of asking, should I say a counsellor or psychologist? People are often really asking something else. They are asking, what is happening here? Or why does this keep showing up? Or what does this reaction mean? Concepts like anxiety, attachment, emotional regulation, or safety are tools for understanding those questions. These are not diagnoses, they are ways of describing patterns that many people recognize in themselves and others. For example, anxiety is often spoken about as a feeling, but it also shows up in behavior. Checking emails repeatedly, replaying conversations, avoiding decisions, preparing excessively. When you hear the word anxiety, which of these feels familiar to you? Attachment is another concept people hear often. In everyday terms, it shows up in how comfortable we feel depending on others, how we respond to closeness, and how we handle distance. Some people move towards reassurance, others pull away to regain space. Where do you notice yourself leaning when relationships feel uncertain? These are not problems to be fixed, they are patterns to be understood. Counselling and therapy offer structured ways of exploring these concepts, but the concepts themselves are part of ordinary human experience. They show up at work, in friendships, in families, and in intimate relationships. By understanding the professional landscape, it becomes easier to use these concepts without confusion. Counsellors, psychotherapists, and psychologists may all work with ideas like anxiety or attachment, but they may approach them differently depending on their role and their training. This is why moving from labels to concepts is often the most helpful next step for listeners. Once you understand who does what, you can focus less on titles and more on meaning. In the next episode, we'll make this shift explicitly by exploring what anxiety actually is in everyday life, how it operates, and why it shows up in the ways people recognize immediately. That's the scope of this episode. Each episode focuses on one specific theme, and that was it. We'll leave it here for now and move on in the next episode.